Hi there everyone, welcome to our video this week on Plato's Phaedo dialogue. Importantly, you might have heard other people in your life say Phaedo or Fido or something like that, and that's perfectly fine because this is in no way a Greek pronunciation course, right? So however you get there is perfectly okay. I've heard many professional philosophers say a lot of different pronunciations of this dialogue. I'm going to be saying Fido throughout. And it's a real treat to be able to discuss this dialogue with you all. Speaking personally, this is like I don't know if it's my favorite Plato dialogue, but it's definitely up there. It's one of them for sure. And it provides a really, really fascinating and, in my view, quite epic conclusion to, the sequence of the trial and death in Socrates that we've been covering for this class. And importantly, you can start to detect some shifts that take place in how Plato is deciding to write these dialogues that is interesting for us to pay attention to together. Now, as far as general place setting for the Phaedo dialogue, the Phaedo takes place sometime after the Crito dialogue. Crito tried to bust his, erstwhile friend Socrates out of jail. Socrates was himself not interested in escaping from his imprisonment and instead chose once again to await his execution. There was a religious festival that took place at the time that delayed Socrates' execution, so he was alive in prison for a couple of months. And the beginning of the dialogue really recounts Socrates explaining what he did during this time, producing art and so on, right? But what really happens is that Socrates' friends, these people that he knew in his life, right, that maybe knew his children or his wife or something like that, right, these people are all like really bothered. They're really concerned by the fact that, their important and, quite legendary, of course, friend Socrates is really actually going to be put to death, right? And so they're in the process of like almost mourning over this fact, right? And according to Phaedo's recollection of events, uh, Socrates, admonishes all of his friends and these people that came to, spend his last moments with him, saying something to the effect of, like, hey, I'm a true philosopher, and as a true philosopher, as I mentioned in the apology, I don't fear death, okay? So I don't feel very bad about this. And, you all can make plans about what you're going to do with my body, but that's not me, and so I don't care. And, you know, this is Socrates' general attitude towards his friends. And so the Phaedo dialogue is really situated at this moment where, in his very last moments, Socrates is beckoned by, his friends to philosophize one last time, to explain why it is and how it is that he can be so unmoved in the face of his real and imminent physical endangerment, right? Socrates was forced to drink hemlock. And if you were to Google this or look it up in any way, drinking hemlock is a very brutal and nasty and long way to go. It is not pleasant by any stretch of the imagination. It's nothing like taking like a cyanide pill or something like that in the movies and you instantly fall over dead. No, it's like an incredibly painful enterprise, right? And Socrates, at least on Plato's account, went through it and was, in a way, like he was the epitome of manliness, right? His ability to withstand the pain and stay true to his convictions, even in his final moments, right? These deathbed moments are like really, really important for historical figures because it's often at these moments that we want to try to read back some kind of repentance or something in them, like they realized their mistake at the last moment, right? And Socrates and Plato, right, write the dialogue in such a way that you could not do that, right? It's completely and totally evident from at least Plato's depiction of Socrates that Socrates was fully ready and willing to go at this point, right? And the Phaedo is an amazing dialogue because it gives a rigorous philosophical reason for why Socrates can have this attitude, and it starts to build up what we might call like Platonic as opposed to Socratic philosophy proper. And to see how that's the case, I think it's worthwhile for us to really emphasize in particular the difference between the apology and the Phaedo, right? These are obviously closely connected dialogues, right? The apology is Socrates at his trial that he loses, right? And now the Phaedo is actually at his execution, right? And in each case, Socrates tries to make the point that as a philosopher, that he cannot fear death, and so cannot be motivated by like pragmatic reasons associated with like not dying, for example, right? But we can also detect, even though these dialogues are very closely related, some important differences in how they're written, how they're presented, and what Socrates' real message is in this case. And so we can detect, in a way, that Plato here is starting to talk a little bit more, right, than Socrates traditionally would talk, right? We see a lot more of Socrates teaching others rather than Socrates seeking wisdom and trying to be taught by others, right? And so Plato's scholars will sometimes talk about an early, middle, and late period in his dialogues, right? And it's important to emphasize that these are all reconstructions, right? We don't have the dates. Plato wouldn't have written the dates, certainly not in reference to, our dating system, right? And so there is really no evidence, like hard evidence in that way, about which dialogues Plato actually wrote first, right? But generally, Plato scholars tend to agree that there's a kind of development to how Plato decides to write his dialogues, right? And exactly which dialogue goes into what category and so on is something that's very controversial. It's not something that, a bunch of Plato scholars really agree on, right? So, these are tools, descriptive tools for us to notice differences in Plato's writing, but it's not like Plato himself was like, yeah, I have an early, a middle, and a late period, right? Certainly not. Plato would probably insist on the wider unity of what he has to do, right? But what the Apology and the Phaedo let us do is to locate certain kinds of differences between what we would call Plato's early period and Plato's middle period, right? We can think of, and I've written here, the Apology as an example of an early Plato text, and we can think about the Phaedo as a more distinctively middle Plato text, right? I've written out here an example of something that would be considered a late dialogue, but we're not really going to get into that in any detail at all today. I just want to be able to point you to an example, right? Because people will talk about this as well. And one thing that we can notice as a difference between the Apology and the Phaedo are some of the central themes, right? In the early dialogues, that are also actually called Socratic dialogues because it's believed that it reflected Socrates' actual behavior better, right? These tended to emphasize as a theme Socrates' ignorance, right? And as a consequence, the way that the dialogue is staged is that it's Socrates normally combating one of the sophists, right? And so in the Apology, the sophists don't really talk that much, right? It's not like they intervene in the dialogue. It's kind of a huge monologue in that way. But they still nonetheless have a strong presence in the dialogue, right? The sophists are exactly those who charge Socrates with impiety, with corrupting the youth, and so on, right? And so Socrates' own account in the Apology is structured around a conversation with these sophists, right? And like in the Euthyphro, for example, his attitude towards them is like, oh, maybe I can learn from them because they know what wisdom is really all about, right? But in the Phaedo, right, Plato decides not to emphasize Socrates' ignorance like he did in the Apology. Socrates' ignorance doesn't come up anymore, right? And similarly, instead of Socrates being like a student of wisdom, Socrates is like a teacher, right? All of these people, his former students, are sort of flocking to him. They're asking him for philosophical wisdom, and he's dispensing some philosophical wisdom, right? And so in those moments, you can see a really profound shift. In the beginning, Socrates was like a student, and now Socrates is like a teacher, right? Socrates is now making a positive claim to wisdom. And this is reflected in how some of the points are made, right? Both the Apology and the Phaedo emphasize the theme of death and the fear of death, right? But the Apology tended to highlight the fact that Socrates didn't know what was going to happen after death, right? And it's because Socrates didn't know what was going to happen after death that fearing it would be kind of unphilosophical, right? But here we have the exact opposite approach, where Socrates not only fails to fear death, but seems to, in a way, positively embrace it, right? He, at one point, the kind of last quotation that we're going to talk about together, he says something to the effect that death is going to be a cure for the ills of life. And the Phaedo dialogue was also known as On the Soul, because in the Phaedo dialogue, Plato, through the mouthpiece of Socrates, claims to have a proof for the existence of an immortal soul. So Socrates doesn't have to fear death, which he interprets to be the separation of the soul from the body, but positively embraces it and argues positively that any philosopher should have that attitude towards death, right? And so we can see a shift, right? The early dialogues are more traditionally Socratic. Socrates is speaking for himself and generally emphasizing how much he doesn't know, right? Whereas the middle dialogues, like the Phaedo, another example would be the Republic, is a lot of Socrates dispensing wisdom to people. And you know that when Socrates kind of starts to do this, that this is more Plato speaking through the mouthpiece of Socrates. Now, this third column, I'm not really going to spend much time on because we're not reading a late Platonic dialogue in this context, right? But generally, these late dialogues are also interesting because now we get a shift again. Here, in a way, we return to some of the early themes in that the late themes tend to emphasize challenges to the theory of forms that Plato puts forward in his middle period. So, just as an example, not something that we're going to be reading together, unfortunately, but the Parmenides is a really interesting dialogue because it stages a confrontation between a young, a slightly less philosophically sophisticated Socrates and Parmenides and Zeno, who are two pre-Socratic philosophers, so philosophers before even Socrates. And these dialogues are characterized by them asking all sorts of probing questions about Socrates' theory of the forms, right? So if the early dialogues depict Socrates late in his life, but where he's still kind of a student. The middle dialogues depict Socrates as a teacher, as a dispenser of wisdom. These late dialogues either tend to depict Socrates very early in his life, or they might just not even have Socrates in it at all. Sometimes they'll have, a totally different character be the spokesperson, kind of, for Plato's beliefs. And so that makes these really interesting and unique and different and appropriate for a much higher level class, right? But it's very interesting to just note these general differences, and in particular to be able to note the differences between what are traditionally early or Socratic dialogues and these middle, more Platonic dialogues, right? They're all written by Plato, but here Plato is really putting his own perspective on the line, right? So now that we've contextualized this view sufficiently, I think let's get into some close readings. This first quote I have for you right here, it says, quote, "I think a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy is probably right to be in good cheer in the face of death," right, on 63e. So this is really something like the thesis statement. This is what Socrates is really seeking to prove throughout the Phaedo dialogue. And so I think that this is, in an attempt to be an explanation for Socrates' real actual behavior in the dialogue, right? Why is Socrates happy even though he's going to die? Well, because he thinks that all true philosophers should be happy in the face of death, right? That sounds a little bit strange, right? But why is that so? Here we get quote number 2, quote, "The one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for death and dying." This is related to a quotation that I said earlier, which is that for Plato and the Socrates of the Phaedo, death is the separation of the soul from the body. And so, the case that Plato is trying to make in the Phaedo is that the philosopher is someone who is not concerned with, like, for example, all of the particular instances of piety, but they're interested in the form of piety itself, right? And so what they want to know is not the sort of thing that your sense apparatus can tell you about these particular cases, but what the philosopher seeks is a kind of wisdom that happens when you use your soul, when you go beyond, when you don't fixate in particular on the examples, but you attend to the nature of the form itself. This is the basic point of Plato's Phaedo dialogue, is he's trying to introduce what we know as Plato's theory of the forms and connecting that with the theme of an immortal soul, and hence Socrates' own relationship to death and to dying. Hence, in the Phaedo, Plato paints a rather dualistic picture, right? There is the world of the senses, which is everything I can see and hear and touch and, grab and hold on to and so on, right? The ways that I learn about particular events, examples, etc., that exist in the world, right? And also instances where I feel anger or hatred or desire or love or something like that. These emotions, Plato also thinks are bodily in nature. He describes the experience of pain or the experience of like great pleasure as like a rivet stitching the soul to the body, right? Those moments, for example, where I eat like a really yummy steak or something like that, right? And I'm very happy with myself and very pleased. And then I want to orient my behavior. I'm like, oh yeah, I can't wait until I can satisfy my body again, right? Because my body is not just satisfied with that steak. I need another steak, right? I need more. Whatever pleasure I have is necessarily transitory. It's going to end very quickly. The steak runs out, right? And then I need another steak. And so, in a way, when you attend to the body, when you attend to your desires in this way, you are further attaching yourself to the material world. And consequently, for Plato, you're more likely to remain in error and deception. You're likely to, be so caught up in your own desires that you can't think clearly, right? Whereas philosophers are characterized by the fact that they shun the body, right? They're not interested in pleasure for its own sake or something like that, but they are interested in wisdom, which you don't get through satisfying your body in any way, right? And to make Plato's point, I think it's very helpful to attend to mathematical examples, right? Just like we did in the Meno. And there's a little bit of this dialogue, even though it can be kind of confusing a little bit, right? And hence we got quote number 3 here. Quote, "We say there's something that is equal. I do not mean a stick equal to a stick or a stone equal to a stone or anything of that kind, but something else beyond these, the equal itself," right? So what is Plato's point? Well, okay, beyond all of the instances of numbers being equal, there is something like the category itself, the idea, equality, right? And on Plato's view, what makes all of the individual numbers that are equal is that they have a share in the equal itself, right? That might sound a little bit odd, right? But you might think about the equal itself as being like a rule or something like that. And then you might think about all of the particular equal numbers as themselves being participations in equality, right? So what does that mean? Well, the equal itself would be something like divisibility by 2, right? And then divisibility by 2 is like the rule that you can then use to determine, okay, well, what numbers are equal? Well, the equal numbers are those that are divisible by 2, those that participate in the equal itself. And importantly for Plato, right, even if there were no particular instances, right, of equality, right? Imagine you have a mathematical relation, mathematical number, where there just happens to be nothing, no number given, that is divisible by 2, right? This would not, on Plato's view, affect the reality of the equal itself, right? There is something that is equality, even if there are no particular instances of equality in my waking life or around me or anything like that, right? Similarly, as we're going to see in the next quote, there's something like justice in itself, right? What a just world would be like, even if our own world is itself unjust, even if there are no or very limited instances of particular instantiations of justice, there is still for Plato, in a world different from the material world, the just itself, right? Um, and hence, like, maybe human beings haven't achieved justice yet. Maybe they will achieve justice and, truly participate in the form of justice at some future point. But it's not like the elimination or the lack of instances of justice takes anything away from the fundamental reality of justice by itself, right? So, in the same way that there is something like equality and equal in itself, a mathematical relationship that we can define and then we can determine particular instances of it, so too Plato thinks that there are forms of justice, the beautiful, the good, the great, and so on. He even thinks that there are forms of, as he says, tallness and smallness, right? So let's read number 4 here for some additional context. It says, quote, I assume the existence of a beautiful, itself by itself, of a good and a great, and all of the rest. If you grant me these and agree that they exist, I hope you to show the cause as a result and to find the soul to be immortal. Right? So what is the claim here? Well, the reason why we can come to know and describe mathematical relationships, even if we never encounter them in the physical world, is, for Plato, because this information is in our souls, right? What do I mean by that? Well, think about like any number. Think about the number 7, for example, right? One way of describing the number 7 is as 5 plus 2, or as 3 plus 4, or as 6 plus 1, and so on, right? And through the number 7 that all of these mathematical relationships are equal, right? You could equally define the 7 in terms of 2 plus 5 or 3 plus 4 or so on and so forth, right? The particular instance that you're using to define the relationship doesn't matter because that number, that relationship exists on its own. And even if your math teacher teaches you arithmetic and they only teach you that 3 plus 4 equals 7, you can then go out and find out on your own. Oh, well, also 8 minus 1 equals 7, 9 minus 2. And, for all of these instances and examples that you never encounter in the material world and that your teacher never teaches you, right? You have the ability to, once you understand the rules of mathematics, then apply those rules well beyond the parameters of what has been given to you at this point, right? And hence, Plato thinks that you have something like an innate idea, an idea that is in your soul and that you can pull out entirely of yourself by yourself. And in the same way that we can describe numerical relationships that are timeless, that are always true, that are necessarily true, that are not undermined in any way by their lack of particular instantiations, so too we can find a beautiful itself, a good itself, a great itself, and so on. And the soul is immortal precisely because the soul is also timeless, right? And in being timeless, it is then able to participate, to discover these forms, right? In the same way that in the Euthyphro, it's Socrates, by ignoring the examples, ignoring what's, in front of him, what his senses tell him to pay attention to, that he asks not about particular examples of piety, but about the form of piety itself, right? And so knowledge of the forms, knowledge of fundamental reality, right? Why is it fundamental reality? Well, because equal numbers are equal in virtue of participating in the equal. Beautiful objects are beautiful not because they have colors or lights or whatever. Why? Because those colors and lights are in non-beautiful things, right? But a beautiful itself by itself, and a good and a great itself by itself. And it's only because the soul itself transcends the mortal realm that it can come to know and to remember these forms from before the mortal realm caused it, to forget all of these ideas, right? And hence our last quote, Socrates' final words, really, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Make this offering and do not forget, right? It can be kind of hard to understand the context of this quote, but the reason why this quote is really cool and kind of metal, right, is he's saying right before he drinks the hemlock and dies that they should make an offering to a god of health, right? People, footnote says that people would sort of pray to Asclepius and provide offerings to Asclepius when they were sick, right? And the idea is if they were, healed from their sickness, then they would provide an offering. And in this moment, when Socrates is about to die and drink the hemlock and breathe his final breath, he conceives of this moment as himself being healed from a sickness, right? Being healed of the vicissitudes and the dangers and the dissatisfactions of having a mortal body to commune eternally with the forms. I'm so looking forward to what you all think about this dialogue. What do you think about Plato's arguments, right? Some of the things that he's saying are kind of out there and wild, but I think that they have a lot of really positive things to say in their favor. So I'm really looking forward to reading about your opinions, and I hope that you all have a great week. Bye.